The note sat on Harriet's desk for 2 more days, folded neatly and positioned precisely at the far edge, where her gaze landed on it every time she looked up from her work. She had read it 5 times, no, 6, she corrected herself, and analysed every line, every curve of the handwriting, seeking to unravel its intent. Her mind spun. The thought of tea with a stranger, particularly one she had no means of preparing for, was unbearable. What would they talk about? What questions might he ask? What if she failed to meet some unspoken expectation, or worse, said something wrong? No, it was better to avoid the risk altogether. She had carefully crafted a world she could understand and manage, and the idea of stepping outside it made her stomach churn. By Thursday morning, Harriet had decided to bury herself in her cataloguing project, a task that never failed to bring her comfort. She had risen early, armed with her notebook and pencil, to take note of the ivy creeping along the garden walls and the sparrows darting through the hedgerows. It was a day of pure familiarity, perfectly planned, and she intended to keep it that way. But her plans rarely survived her mother's interventions. "Harriet," Agnes began, her voice tight with suppressed exasperation as she approached the doorway to Harriet's room. Her tone was the same one she used when Harriet refused to attend village balls or wear ribbons in her hair. "You've received an invitation from an interested gentleman, and you've simply decided to ignore it?" Harriet did not look up from her notebook. "I did not ignore it. I considered it, and decided not to go." Agnes stepped into the room, her skirt bustling. "At your age, Harriet, you cannot afford to be so choosy. 25 is not 20, and heaven knows the options are fewer every year. You must take these opportunities when they arise." "Mother," Harriet replied patiently, "I do not know this gentleman. And besides, I have work to do." "Work? You mean your lists and sketches?" Agnes gestured at the desk cluttered with botanical diagrams and meticulous notes. "Harriet, this is not work. It is an obsession, and it will not provide you prospects or companionship." Harriet's grip tightened on her pencil. She despised these conversations, and the way her interests were constantly dismissed as trivial. But arguing with her mother was like trying to move a boulder uphill. It only exhausted her fragility. "You are going," Agnes declared with finality. "I won't hear another word about it. This apparent gentleman went through the trouble and courage of arranging this, and I'll not have you embarrass him, or us, by declining." And so, after much coaxing, Harriet found herself dressed in her best cream gown and bonnet that afternoon, seated stiffly at a corner table in the red fern tea room, alone. The room smelled of cinnamon and baked goods, and her hands rested awkwardly on the frayed tablecloth as she waited. She had come, as her mother insisted, but her anxiety thrummed under her skin. She wished desperately to be back in her garden, where the rhythms of nature were predictable and comforting. When the gentleman finally arrived, Harriet had to stifle a sigh. He stood tall, thin, and impeccably dressed with muted blonde hair, but his demeanour struck her as overly self-assured. He approached the table with an exaggerated bow. His smile suggested he found the whole situation very amusing. This filled Harriet with caution and some resentment. "Miss Grant," he said with a flourish, taking the seat across from her. "The pleasure is mine. I am Arthur Crawford." "Mr. Crawford," Harriet replied, her voice polite but distant. What followed was a painfully awkward exchange. Mr. Crawford launched into a monologue about his love for fine wines and horse racing, punctuated by anecdotes about his own supposed cleverness. Harriet, unsure how to respond, attempted to redirect the conversation to topics she understood: birds, wood moss, saplings, but she fell into a long-winded ramble. Mr. Crawford would only react with indifference before letting out a patronising chuckle, hastily moving on to his next anecdote. Something about Mr. Crawford's reaction left her feeling embarrassed. When their tea arrived, Harriet felt a flare of relief at the sight of the lemon drizzle cake she had ordered. Her usual request, her comfortable acquaintance. Any other cake would be displeasing. She carefully sliced it into neat squares, savouring the predictability of its sweetness. Mr. Crawford, meanwhile, insisted on jokingly tasting every pastry on the tray to the server's dismay as well as Harriet's, declaring them either adequate or a complete travesty. Much time later, as the tea service dwindled and the last crumbs of lemon drizzle cake sat untouched on Harriet's plate, Mr. Crawford cleared his throat. His smile was still in its usual place, but it seemed thinner now, less buoyant than when they had first sat down. He leaned back slightly, regarding Harriet with a polite but measured gaze. "Miss Grant," he began, his voice careful, "this has been a most enlightening afternoon. Beyond expectations, one could say." Harriet felt gratified but tamed her expression. "I'm glad you think so. I quite enjoyed explaining the nesting habits of wood pigeons. Few people understand how their migratory patterns are influenced by—" "Yes, indeed," Mr. Crawford interrupted gently, raising his brows. "Fascinating, truly. You have quite a unique way of seeing the world." Harriet blinked, unsure what that meant, but ultimately agreeing. "Yes, I suppose I do." "You're clearly a woman of great intelligence, Miss Grant, and your passion for botany, was it? Sorry." "Botany and ornithology," she corrected, her tone brightening. "Though I suppose I also dabble in—" "Yes, brilliant," he said again, with a small chuckle that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, it's admirable, truly. But if I may speak plainly—" He paused, then forged ahead. "I'm not sure we're quite as suited to one another as I presumed." Harriet stared at him, her brow furrowing. "Not suited? Why? I hope I have not offended you, Mr. Crawford." "No, no," he said quickly, leaning forward as if to reassure her. "Not at all. It's just— how shall I put it? We seem to view the world through very different lenses. I find myself struggling to connect." Harriet felt bewildered, her mind turning over Mr. Crawford's words like an unfamiliar plant. "Do you mean perhaps that I did not quite follow your humour?" Mr. Crawford gave a rueful smile. "Well, yes, among other things. You're fascinating, Miss Grant, and clearly someone who deserves admiration, but I suspect we're simply speaking two different languages." Harriet didn't respond immediately. Instead, she folded her hands neatly in her lap, her gaze dropping to the splintered wood floors. "I see. I am obliged to you for your honesty." Mr. Crawford relaxed slightly, relieved by her calm response. "Of course. It's nothing against you, truly. You're remarkable, just not in a way that I think I could ever fully grasp." She nodded slowly, feeling the familiar pang of disconnection. "I understand," she said. But do I? Harriet thought. They parted soon after, with Mr. Crawford bowing as gallantly as he did in his introduction, and Harriet offering a polite curtsy. As she walked away from the tea room, she couldn't shake the echo of his words. He hadn't been cruel nor dismissive. In fact, he had been seemingly candid. But his message was still unclear. There was something about her, something fundamental, that set her apart in a way he couldn't bridge. This wasn't the first time either. For a moment, Harriet allowed herself a wry smile. Two different languages. Perhaps that's true. But I like the language I speak. As Harriet walked along the cobblestone path back to the Grant house, her thoughts stirred with the conversation and the silences she had endured with Mr. Crawford. She clutched her dress tightly, her steps deliberate, as if each one could ground her in the face of her swirling frustration. "I don't understand," she muttered under her breath, the words tumbling out in the quiet of the lane. "I witness so many others, perfectly incompatible, and yet they marry as if it's the simplest thing in the world. Jane and Eleanor, for instance, neither of them shares a single meaningful interest with their husbands, but they managed it somehow." A sparrow darted across her path, and she paused to note its soft chirp before continuing. "I had thought our meeting was pleasant enough," she murmured to herself, her fingers brushing absently against the edges of mossy cobbled stones. I spoke about my passions. I answered his questions. And yet he still found me disjointed. Is it that they fabricate unfounded flaws, or that I so often miss things that others understand so easily? Her gaze dropped to the ground with some despair. If others can learn to get along with men who talk endlessly about wine and horses, why can't I? Surely I could manage to be polite, agreeable, even charming if I tried harder. Harriet consciously counted her steps on the cobblestone, perfectly placing each step into each separate stone. Harriet stopped at the garden gate of the house, her thoughts still tangled. She looked up at the ivy climbing the stone walls and felt a small, familiar ache. "What makes me so different?" she murmured. "How am I so different from Mr. Crawford or my mother or sisters?" The question hung in the air as she pushed open the gate and stepped into the garden, where the only voices were the rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. As Harriet stepped through the garden gate and made her way toward the house, the sight of home offered her a moment of solace, but it was short-lived. Just as she reached the door, her father appeared on the threshold, his expression a blend of curious and restless. "There you are, Harriet," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd gone astray." "No, father," Harriet replied quietly, brushing past him. She was not prepared for his subtle rebukes as he did not let her escape so easily. "I trust your meeting went well." Harriet paused. "It was sufficient." "Sufficient," he echoed, his tone suggesting that this was precisely the problem. "Well, I hope you found time to prepare yourself for more company. Your sisters and their husbands will be arriving tomorrow." Harriet froze mid-step, her stomach twisting. "Both of them?" "Yes, both. It's been far too long since we've all gathered as a family, and your mother insisted. No doubt they'll want to hear all about your endeavours." Endeavours. The word felt like a polite euphemism for her eccentricities, the way her family often dressed up their disapproval in softer language. Harriet felt the weight of impending questions, the scrutinising glances, and Jane's inevitable exasperation. Jane, with her polished manners and well-meaning but sharp-tongued critiques, had little patience for Harriet's quirks. But Eleanor was different. The thought of Eleanor's visit eased Harriet's tension ever so slightly. Though Eleanor shared the family's concerns about Harriet's future, Eleanor had always had a gentler approach. She asked thoughtful questions about Harriet's notebooks, indulged her in long conversations about birds and wildflowers, and never seemed drained when Harriet got lost in her enthusiasm. Eleanor even had a way of making light of Harriet's struggles, offering her a kind word or a shared laugh instead of a lecture. Unlike Jane, Eleanor didn't try to fix her. Still, Harriet's relief at Eleanor's presence couldn't fully erase the anxiety that Jane's visit brought. The two sisters, so different in temperament, had a way of balancing each other, but Harriet often felt caught in the middle, assured one moment and gently scolded the next. Her father, oblivious to her swirling thoughts, gave her a gentle nod. "You'd best be prepared. They'll be here by midday." As he disappeared into his study, leaving Harriet in the dim hallway, the silence of the house pressed around her, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves outside. She glanced toward the window, where the ivy's confidence reached upward, resilient and unbothered by anything but the sun and rain. "How perfect you are," Harriet thought. Tomorrow would be a trial. She knew it, but at least Eleanor's presence would be a balm. Perhaps they might slip away for a time, wandering the garden paths as Harriet chatted about the nesting sparrows or the mushrooms she had spotted in the damp earth. For a little while at least, she could feel treasured. But the thought of Jane continued to loom heavy. Her gaze dropped to the sun-kissed steps. Why does everything have to be discourse? Why can't I just be? Would Eleanor's visits always be comforting, or would even she start to lose patience for reasons Harriet couldn't understand? The question lingered in the dust-speckled air as Harriet climbed the stairs to her room, the weight of the impending day settling heavily on her drooped shoulders.